Happy New Year everybody, and welcome to a brand new video from me, Pickles Park Reviews. Now today I'm going to be reviewing the New Year's special of Doctor Who, titled Eve of the Daleks. Now, I obviously watched the episode on New Year's Day, however I didn't record my instant reaction like I did for Flux and the previous New Year's special Revolution, mainly because I wasn't really sure what I thought of the special, whilst also not really feeling as if I had that much to say about it. And in the days since, I still don't really know how I feel about this special, and that's not really because it's controversial or anything. I just think that it's a bit weird in terms of how I feel about it. In one sense, it's quite underwhelming, but then also, is the fact that it's underwhelming a good thing? And that might sound a bit weird. I'm going to delve into my thoughts on it a bit deeper in this video, but I found it a bit polarising. Now, when I finished watching the episode, I thought I enjoyed myself. That was a solid bit of Doctor Who, you know, nothing really special, just a solid, fun, Base Under Siege story with the Daleks. And I thought, yep, that was a lot of fun. And then I think the more I sort of felt about it, I thought, was this really, you know, satisfying? Was this perhaps a bit underwhelming? And I think that's always the danger you're going to run into when you have a one-off special that is one episode just on its own with no episodes before or after, is that therefore you're pinning all your hopes on one 60-minute episode and therefore almost has to meet the expectations of a whole series. It has to be as satisfying as that because it's a similar weight. Now, I think this episode had the help of Flux was less than a month ago, therefore there wasn't that much hype and build up to this special, not like there was for Revolution, in which there was nearly a year's wait, and therefore there was a whole lot of speculation building up to that special. That wasn't the case for this, so therefore I think it made it feel less underwhelming, and it more was just like, oh, this is like a nice little bonus episode more than this is a special we've been waiting ages for, like Revolution. And those who watched my initial review of Revolution or have heard me speak about it since would know that I wasn't all that hot on Revolution. I think there were parts of it that I really enjoyed, and I still think are really good. But I think it had a lot of ideas. It felt that Christian threw in the kitchen sink and then some into that story. There's so many different ideas and plot threads and strands in that story, and not a lot of them are really all that satisfying. I think that so many of the elements of that story get rushed or just chucked to the wayside because there just wasn't enough time to fulfill all these different elements, and therefore it comes across as a story that had so much potential but just feels really rushed and unsatisfying. And I never really understood why people love that story as much, because to me, yeah, it had some really quite brilliant ideas, but it doesn't really do anything with any of them. And this special, you could argue, is almost the complete antithesis to Revolution of the Daleks, whereas that felt like an episode with a series full of plot threads that had all been shoved into 60 minutes, bursting at the seams with locations, characters, ideas that didn't leave the episode with that much time to breathe and didn't allow it to satisfyingly wrap up all these really brilliant ideas. You've got Eve of the Daleks, which in a way is very light on ideas, it's light on locations, it's light on characters, and it isn't really phenomenal in terms of the plot. It isn't extraordinary, it isn't, you know, oh my god, that's such a brilliant idea, like I'd say the defense drones were, for example, in Revolution. That's not the case with this. It's just Groundhog Day with the Daleks and Base Under Siege, and that isn't a particularly extraordinary idea, if you get me. But then again, perhaps its simpleness is what makes this episode at least watchable and fulfilling in the 60-minute runtime. I watched it and there wasn't a point where I really felt, oh, there wasn't enough time dedicated to this, or you know, there wasn't enough done with that, or you know, that ending feels a bit rushed, or you know, perhaps they could have spent more time on this. Realistically, in terms of how the story was told, it fitted this 60-minute runtime, and if you watch my Christmas video on Christmas specials, you'll know that my biggest issue with the New Year specials, and particularly with Revolution of the Daleks, was just there were so many elements and 60 minutes just wasn't enough time to tell a grandiose Dalek story. And in my opinion, they should have made New Year specials an hour and a half. We know the BBC have time to facilitate that TV because obviously things like Sherlock and Dracula since have undergone the hour and a half runtime, and even Sherlock was that a New Year's Eve or Days special, The Abominable Bride? I can't quite remember, but that was an hour and a half obviously, so we know that the BBC can put that on. So I think to just make these specials feel a bit more special, it would be nice if you could have an hour and a half with a big grandiose story to really make it feel like a special, and I feel as if that would have been a good thing to do with the New Year specials, mainly because you don't have to crowbar in Christmas. These are very much stories in their own right, and it seems like Shimnel decided to designate the New Year specials for Dalek stories, although I think that's probably only really just sort of coincidentally happened. I think he just decided to introduce the Dalek in Resolution and then decided to make it a New Year's special duology by having the Daleks return in Revolution. People have been describing this as a Dalek New Year's Day trilogy, but I think it was Harbo on Twitter mentioned that it's not really a trilogy, it's a duology and then a completely unrelated Dalek New Year's Day special. Either of the Daleks isn't connected to the prior two Dalek stories in the Chibnall era at all. It's very much its own standalone entity. It's very self-contained as a story in itself. Yes, there are slight links to Flux, but they're incredibly tenuous that it feels very contained, and in a sense that's why this episode works. It doesn't have to draw in any bigger elements to make the story perhaps feel overstuffed or that it can't be fulfilled in the 60-minute runtime. It has a small-scale story, small-scale plot, and that can play out with ease over 60 minutes. But also you could argue that that is an issue, that it is so contained, given that it is wrapping up certain aspects of Flux that perhaps don't get all satisfying resolutions. I think that the whole idea of the TARDIS, it's nice to see that they're trying to fix the TARDIS following the events of Flux, but I think knowing that that is what was going to happen, we were all perhaps a bit more interested in the reason why the TARDIS was acting all weird and, you know, degrading and that sort of thing over the course of Flux, and we don't really get an explanation for it. I guess it's just Flux was the reason for that, I suppose. But yeah, even though it's nice to see that carried over into this and have consequences and see that that hasn't just, you know, ended, you know, let's put a full stop there and that's the chapter over, moving on to other stuff. It's nice to see that there are still some consequences from Flux into these stories, but I think perhaps more could have been made of why the TARDIS was acting all weird rather than, oh, that's fixed now. Although I did like that we see the interior almost changing, as if that's what it's like when the interior changes from Doctor to Doctor. That was quite a nice almost peek behind the curtain. We see just enough for it to be an incredible visual, but not too much that it ruins the mystique. That was a very nice visual. But also I think the fact that it is so self-contained, despite the fluxy elements that I feel as if there could have been perhaps a little bit more done with, but I wouldn't say that's necessarily this story's fault. That's just Flux not really explaining things, and I presume we get an answer here, and we're never going to get an answer. But also, the fact that this is so self-contained works, as I said, because it's focusing on its own relatively small-scale plot, so that can work well in the 60-minute format. But also, I think it jars quite violently with Flux. The last series we had, Series 13, was incredibly, obviously, interconnected and interwoven, and each episode ended on a cliffhanger and all these different strands that I think it can feel a bit jarring. Getting an episode that feels so self-contained, so its own entity, with smaller stakes when compared to the massive universe-bending, you know, Time Lord shenanigans that we've got with Flux, to have such a small-scale story, I think is a bit jarring. Now, that's not me saying that I think it was a bad thing to do this. You know that I love my smaller scale and self-contained stories. I'm a big believer in that filler doesn't really exist within Doctor Who, and that, you know, we should still have these self-contained stories in series. I think getting rid of quote-unquote filler episodes is stupid, because I don't think quote-unquote filler episodes exist, because by that metric, most of Doctor Who is filler. But anyway, that's a tangent. Ultimately, I like these self-contained episodes. I'm merely pointing out that the fact that maybe why this feels a little bit underwhelming is because we have been used to watching interwoven and big grandiose stories that perhaps a more small-scale story like this may feel a bit ineffective and a bit pointless, in inverted commas. And I think another reason why perhaps this story feels a bit more underwhelming than perhaps it would be otherwise is because it involves the Daleks. Now, it feels as if we've really taken a bit of a nosedive realistically in terms of the Daleks as big grandiose villains, because in this it very much is, oh, it's the Daleks, but this is very much a small scale throwaway story. And it feels as if, you know, the relegation of the Daleks from finales to just any old episode, and then from that to these New Year's Day specials, does feel as if they're not the big bad anymore. And they are just sort of, you know, You know, they don't quite have that same weight that they used to, I think. Personally, I've never been a big fan of the Daleks and New Year's Day specials, because these aren't finales. They don't have the time that finales do, and I think it always makes the Daleks feel quite small scale, because they're not good enough to appear in finales or in the main series. They're just sort of relegated to the, you know, bonus episode, if you will. And in this episode, the Daleks work in this story, but it's not an amazing story. It is sort of a throwaway story. And in my head, am I thinking, is this underwhelming because we expect more from a Dalek story? We expect the Daleks to have more of an impact than I think they have in the Chibnall era. Because even the, and this is more of a issue with the wider Chibnall universe, is that the invasions really don't hit. Like, the events of Revolution of the Daleks might as well have not happened, and it changes nothing. In fact, it almost seems as if it didn't happen, because no one in this recognises a Dalek, and that is a nitpick. I understand that. It doesn't change the story. But I can't help thinking in my head that it does feel that all these quote-unquote invasions of Earth, or alien attacks on Earth, it very much feels as if none of them really hold any weight. None of them really feel as if they happened. It feels as if, you know, it's just clean slate after every single Earth-based Doctor Who story in the Chibnall era, and you know, it seems that just seems to be what we're going. We get no references, but it just feels very hollow. I think the events on Earth in the Chibnall era, they feel incredibly hollow. And it was a little nitpick, but I thought, why don't these people recognise Daleks? Why doesn't John Bishop recognise a Dalek, considering he was around on Earth during the events of Revolution of the Daleks, surely? You know, it's a nitpick, but it's not just this story. It's something that has irritated me in the wider Chibnall era, is it feels as if all these events that take place on Earth feel very hollow and don't really feel as if they've existed. Now, you could say, well, that complaint could be levied at the Moffat era, but I'd say with the Moffat era is that Moffat always sort of shied away from Earth invasions, because that just wasn't his thing. He preferred events and these grandiose stories to take place on alien planets or alien worlds, or, you know, that sort of thing, or, you know, in time itself, or different time zones enough. He was never a big fan of the RTD present day Earth invasions, which is fine. I think it works well for his era. But I think by Chibnall trying to very evidently emulate those Earth invasions, I think he misses a key part of why those worked, and that's because not only do you have loads of supporting characters within those stories who witness those events, your sort of eyes and ears in the wider Earth present day sense, like people like Jackie or Wilf, or those sorts of people who would always be there, so you could see the Earth invasion through their eyes. But also people remember things. They feel as if they left an impact on the wider Doctor Who world that I don't think the Chibnall stories ever do. It doesn't feel like the events of Revolution of Daleks happened in Dan's world, or happened in what's that, for Aisling Bee's world. I can't remember her character name, but doesn't it feel as if that happened in her world, or the events of Spyfall, or the events of Resolution, or even the events of Flux more broadly? It doesn't feel as if any of these characters have experienced a world in which Sontarans invaded and all of the Earth went black for a few seconds. It doesn't feel as if that happened to them, and to me, it is a nitpick, but it's just something that makes this world feel so hollow, which is why whenever we have Earth invasions in the Chibnall era, and it was a complaint I felt with Flux that I don't feel as if I ever really touched on in a video, and the more I thought about it, the more I sort of felt that the Earth invasions really feel really insubstantial, and they don't feel as if they're leaving a mark, and therefore they just don't hit. You don't feel any threat, as if there's anything to lose when these aliens are invading Earth, because they're not really doing anything to our companions. Our companions aren't around on Earth, and we've got no other people that we care about there who experience it in the episodes or then remember it later on. So while it was merely a nitpick in this episode, and the fact I've gone on about it may seem as if it's something that is a massive criticism of this episode, it's not. It's just a wider critique of the Chibnall era that I haven't mentioned before, so I thought I'd mention it here. But, yeah, I honestly can't remember what I was speaking about before going on this tangent. Oh yeah, Dalek stories. That's what I was talking about. Yeah, this is very much a small-scale Dalek story, and while the Daleks are serviceable in here, it feels as if they've certainly lost their large status that they had in the RTD era, and that's slowly been reduced through the Moffat era, and massively, I think, in the Chibnall era, to now in which they're just sort of the throwaway antagonists in this bonus episode, rather than having any sort of impact in Flux itself. And this episode very much reminded me of Closing Time, the Series 6 episode with Matt Smith and James Corden, and you might be wondering why these episodes are vastly different, and I certainly agree, but to me, in terms of how the Cybermen are treated in that compared to the Daleks in this, I think it's very similar, in which the writing team thought we have no time to really introduce a new villain, or create or introduce a new villain. We don't have time to explore that in such a simple story, so let's just take a villain that everyone knows, so we don't have to spend a lot of time setting them up, setting up who they are, what their deal is, what they can do. Everyone knows the Cybermen, so that's why, even though they're a bit underused, that's why they were used in Closing Time. They're a recognisable foe that everyone knows their deal, so they don't have to spend a lot of time dwelling or exploring them. They're just there for the Doctor to face, you know their deal, so we can move on with the story without having to spend a lot of time on them. I feel as if that was the same with the Daleks in here. You could have had a really interesting monster. I think it would have been a lot better story had there been an interesting villain here. You know, perhaps something new, perhaps the villain creates the time loop. But no, we get the Daleks in here, and I think that's very much that the story doesn't have to dwell on who they are, what their deal is. You know the Daleks, you know they want to kill people, that's their deal, boom, here's the story. So I think in a sense they very much are the disposable, recognisable foes. And they operate okay in this story, but I think you can just sense almost a fall from grace of the Daleks from what they were at the start of Modern Who, all the way up to this point. And speaking about what I just mentioned, I do feel as if even though this episode worked fine, I think there was almost a bit of untapped potential with the time loop idea. And I think the time loop idea, while it is a good concept, I think time loop stories are particularly interesting, and it works well in this story. I like the idea that, you know, you have to use each time wisely. You know, you've only got a certain amount of time before it resets, only a certain amount of time before you can do this, so you need to try and keep on making progress. You know, maybe you waste one time to find out something that you can then use in the next. You know, those time loop stories I always find pretty interesting. And this episode is a solid time loop story. It does the whole thing as I mentioned of perhaps you have to use up one of your lives to gain information so then you can use it again. Doctor Who's touched on this a little bit, I think does Heaven Sent have a bit of that, where the Doctor needs to try and get up to that room, so he uses one of his lives to do that before resetting and then finding out that info and then resetting. I'll be honest, it's been many years since I've watched Heaven Sent. I think I've only watched it twice, and once was when it was broadcast, and once I'm pretty sure was in like 2017, so I really can't remember the broader details of Heaven Sent, to be honest with you. But I believe that was touched upon in Heaven Sent. Maybe it wasn't Heaven Sent, but the idea sounds sort of familiar. But that whole idea is maybe not even time loop stories, just the idea is when you've only got a certain amount of lives, those types of stories. I think they're really interesting, and this story does a decent job of that. As I said, the Doctor having to sacrifice some loops in order to find information, in order to make it up to the top floor to find out where these things are, so then they have the information for the next loop in which they can do things better. It's like having multiple lives on a video game. I love that stuff, and this episode does plenty of it. But I think for me, it does begin to get a little bit repetitive, because it's just survive the Daleks, survive the Daleks. You know what the Daleks are doing, why they're there, and what's causing the time loop relatively early on, and therefore there's no real mystery for this story. For me, it would have been interesting if it perhaps was a new foe that the Doctor doesn't know about, and therefore the Doctor has to keep on using their lives to find out about this monster, who they are, what their deal is, what they're doing, how and why they're creating the time loop, and what their ultimate goal is, constantly throughout the loops, and you learn a bit more throughout it. You see a bit more of this foe. Perhaps it's a new foe that can create time loops. That would have been quite cool. And you understand the argument that perhaps this story wasn't long enough for that, particularly with the Phasmin stuff that they wanted to trickle in here. But for me, it just would have made a more compelling story, because while I did like the time loop element of this, and I think it was serviceable with the Daleks, I think there would just been more intrigue, and I think this story genuinely could have been brilliant with this idea that I mentioned, rather than just sort of a serviceable Dalek story with a twist, which it was, and it was serviceable, but I think that perhaps it could have maybe not told the audience its tricks so early, and therefore just left a bit of intrigue. I think that was a bit of a flaw of this story. The supporting cast were fine. I think Aisling B's character, who I really cannot remember the name of, honestly, but she was great. Easily one of the best supporting characters of the Chibnall era, if not the best. She was really good, and I think the reason why is because not only is she a good comic actor, but also there was time dedicated to fleshing out her character and making her a likeable, realistic character. If anything, it starts off with her as the main character and the Doctor merely a supporting player, which was an interesting choice. I thought she was great, and yeah, easily one of the best supporting characters in the Chibnall era, only probably below historical figures, but other than that, she's easily the best one-off, supporting character, I think, in a Chibnall story. She was great. Nick, I don't really know. He's alright, he has some funny lines, but there's not really much to him. He's only really here because you sort of have to have two supporting characters on top of the Doctor, Yaz and Dan. I didn't buy the romance between him and Aisling B, like I just didn't, and it very much felt really repetitive of the romance between Charlotte Ritchie and that other archaeologist guy in Resolution. It almost felt like a copy and paste job from that story, and if I remember rightly, that story did it better, and I just didn't buy it here. I know they were obviously desperately trying to create a parallel between their relationship and the Doctor and Yaz's, but it didn't quite work, and it just felt very forced. Aisling B did not seem to have any connection to this guy whatsoever, or any interest in him, so when they go off at the end, it was like, no, I didn't really buy it, to be honest. I thought the comedy was quite good in this story. Aisling B is very funny, and I think Nick had some funny lines. The Doctor, Yaz and Dan also had some good comedic moments. The Daleks as well, they had some good comedic moments, and particularly like, the Dalek saying, "I am not Nick," which is just funny, knowing that Nicholas Briggs voiced that Dalek. That was quite funny. I don't know if that was an intentional joke or it was just a coincidence. I like to think it was probably intentional from Chibnall. I'd like to think so. But yeah, that was quite funny. There are a few nitpicks you could make, like, why don't the TARDIS team use more methods to try and stop being exterminated by the Daleks? They pretty much accept their death every single time, whereas there are a few ways in which they could have, at least prolongs their survival, even if the Dalek would have got them in the end. Nick ducks down and the two Daleks destroy each other, which was good, but then there's an opportunity in which characters can use that trick again, and they just don't. I thought they would try to use it again, and the Daleks would have been like, we have learnt, like they do a few times in this special, which was nice. I like the more scheming Daleks, but yeah, I think perhaps they don't try enough elaborate ways to escape. I think they just sort of accept their death, which works sometimes, but I think there's more times when they could put up a fight. Also, another reason, as I said, similar to the intrigue, to make this story just perhaps a bit more interesting as you watch it. There wasn't enough elaborate kills from the Daleks. I want this to be like, you know, just the Daleks, just elaborate kills, learning each time. You know, perhaps, someone goes into the room and they lock themselves inside, so the Dalek blows up the room or something like ridiculous like that. Or similar to, if you remember in Dalek, when the Dalek electrocutes all of the soldiers because it's raining, rather than just straight up exterminating them. You know, clever, elaborate kills like that. I think if the Daleks were more elaborate with those kills, it could have been a much more entertaining episode to watch, rather than just straight up exterminating our protagonists every single time. I just think it would have been a bit more entertaining like that. Another nitpick I had was the fact that, yes, the Doctor and co do evade some of the Dalek shots when realistically the Daleks should have killed them. But I don't want to go on about that too much, because to be honest, the whole plot armor debate is not a debate I particularly care for. It's one of those things where you're watching it and you think, that was a bit silly, the Daleks should have got them there. But that's all it is, and that's all it is, and the fact that people are constantly going on about bloody plot armor drives me insane. That it's not that big a deal. It's one of those minor nitpicks where you say, that's a bit weird, or that's a bit of an inconsistency. There you go, that's the end of it. But the fact that people have been going on about this since Flux, and are continuing to go on about it, as if it's some massive deal, it really irritates me. It's not that deep. It's really not that deep. You know, it's one of those logical inconsistencies which is like, that's a bit annoying, but it's not really a detrimental aspect to the story, because it's pretty much in all media. Like, yeah, the best media usually avoids it, but all media has it at some point, and it's sometimes hard to avoid. I agree that they could have done a better job at hiding plot armor, but ultimately it's not that deep, and people are constantly, I see constant arguments about it on Twitter. People going on about plot armor, like, it's really not that deep. I made a tweet on Twitter that I said if I hear anyone else mention plot armor as a legitimate criticism, I might actually leap out of my window. Like, seriously, it was so annoying seeing all this stuff about plot armor. It's a little bit annoying, but it's not that deep, honestly. It's not that much of a big deal that you should spend a lot of time thinking about. It's one of those things that you briefly think about, and then you just discard it, because it's not that deep, it's not that much of a legitimate criticism. Let's talk about Phasmin then, because it gets confirmed in this episode, and I don't really have an opinion on Phasmin. I don't know, I think I have said it in other videos, that I'm not a big fan of the Doctor having romantic interests. I think that it's just something that is a bit weird with the Doctor. Like, it almost doesn't seem like a character who needs to have relationships with people, and particularly not humans. I just think as if it is a bit weird, like, why does the Doctor fancy this human but then had no romantic interest in this human, and it all gets a bit weird. And also just the idea of the age gap is always a bit creepy. I think with Tennant and Rose, it is a bit uncomfortable that he's, you know, a 900-year-old alien and she's 19, and if the Doctor was older, you'd all think it was creepy. So I just think it's a bit weird that when the Doctor's younger, it's socially acceptable to have them interested in a younger person. It's a big grey area, and I think ultimately it's not an angle that particularly interests me with the character of the Doctor. That being said, it was inevitable that Phasmin was going to come true. I say that. I did think that they might not actually do it, but part of me always knew that they were. I would only say that I don't think they'd actually do it because I thought they'd continue to queerbait people and would never do it, because it was getting to the point that it was so obvious, but they weren't outright saying it, that is this starting to get a bit queerbaity? Like, that's not really for me to say. That's for people actually who are LGBTQA+, you know, to say if they think this is queerbait or not. But it was starting to feel like that, and I saw some people say that, but they do confirm it. And as I said, I'm not a big fan of the Doctor and companions having romantic interest, and I think in terms of this relationship with Yaz, it's a bit iffy, mainly because I don't really, and admittedly they don't actually outright confirm this, but I don't really see as if the Doctor has any romantic interest in Yaz. It doesn't come across that way at all, and it would be a bit weird if the Doctor all of a sudden did now, when that doesn't really come through in the series at all. Like, it's very obvious that Yaz likes the Doctor ever since that line in Series 12. I admit it's pretty non-existent in Series 11, and there's like one instance of it in Series 12 that I was thinking, if they bring Phasmin in, it's really going to feel really undeserved and just like not built up to at all. Admittedly, though, there was a lot of laying the groundwork in Flux to now it coming out. It does make sense for the character of Yaz, and it has been built up to. Her attraction to the Doctor makes sense, I can buy it. But the Doctor's returning that affection, alright, they don't really touch on that in this episode, but it didn't really seem as if there's been anything or any build-up to her having an attraction to Yaz. And personally, I would prefer it to go the unrequited route, just because A, it doesn't really seem as if that's been built up to, and B, I just find the Doctor having a romantic attraction to humans in general a bit of a grey area. But that being said, the first, non-heterosexual relationship between Doctor and companion, the first non-heterosexual attraction to the Doctor, being almost rejected, is that a bad look? Is that almost an unfortunate, would that be a bad first, representation of, non-heterosexual love between the Doctor and companion? If the Doctor rejects them, is that almost, creating a bad representation? And is it almost best that they don't do that, because that wouldn't really feel that good, if you know what I mean? In terms of the wider representation, that might be a bit iffy, and I don't really think that would be a good look for the first instance of that to be rejected. I don't necessarily think, in terms of the wider representation, I don't think that would work, but then again, in terms of the character of the Doctor, it would be preferable. So it's a bit of damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think it's almost Christian has written himself into a box here, very much like he did with the Timeless Child. He loves doing this, seemingly. But in terms of Phasmin as a whole, my thoughts on the Doctor and the companion relationships. I don't really like them, but Phasmin was inevitable, and on the whole, I don't really mind it. A few years ago, I would have absolutely hated this, but to be honest, it's inevitable, and I don't really dislike it. I don't really like it, but, I'm pretty meh towards it. At the end of the day, I'm glad that it's made some people happy. So overall, Eve of the Daleks. This is an interesting one. I didn't expect to have that much to say, but I have certainly spoken quite a lot about this episode. I think for me, it's just a case of it was a little bit underwhelming, but then again, it was solid. I think it's underwhelming in the sense that you always want a special that you've been waiting up to be special in that way, because it's like waiting up for a series, it has to be brilliant, and this wasn't. It was just sort of meh. It was middle of the road, sensible, entertaining Doctor Who, but nothing incredible. But then again, I think it was solid in the sense that it did its job. It was a nice base under siege story with the Daleks, a fun time loop gimmick, albeit that perhaps could have been done a little bit better, but on the whole, it was serviceable, it was fine, it was pretty decent. I think that, I prefer it to Revolution and Resolution, I think, just because it knew what it wanted to do, and it got it done well in the time frame. I spoke about Revolution not really getting its ideas across because of a limited runtime, and Resolution, I think, I haven't watched Resolution for a while, and anyone who was around the channel back in 2018, I doubt anyone really is from those days, but I hated Resolution at the time, and I haven't watched it since, so I don't know what my thoughts are towards it now if I was to watch it. But I remember thinking that some of the Dalek stuff was alright, but not only is how the Doctor treats the Daleks, just makes it a bit comical if I remember rightly, but also I think the problem is with Resolution is it tries to be Dalek without understanding that a big part of why Dalek works is the contained environment. You can't do Dalek but try and make it a globe-trotting story. That just doesn't work, and I think that's why that story just didn't really work for me. So this, by taking a contained environment, a simple plot with a twist, admittedly a gimmick, but a twist nonetheless, an interesting story beat, and telling a story that is simple and can be done within the runtime, it makes a solid, enjoyable viewing experience. One thing I would say is that you can quite easily tell that this story was made within COVID conditions. I think it's the clearest example of a story that was clearly made with COVID in mind. You know, it's set in one location, limited cast of characters, and limited props of the Daleks, which they already made and had in storage. I think this is very much a clear case of a story that was conceived in COVID times. Perhaps Chris Chibnall was forced to make a New Year's special and he was like, this is what I'll do. Something along those lines. It was definitely created with COVID in mind. I don't think we will have got this story without COVID being a thing. But then again, it's a nice, solid, self-contained Base Under Siege Dalek story. You know, it's not amazing, but it's just fine. And I think over the course of recording this review, I said at the start I didn't know if it was solid or a bit underwhelming. I think for what it is, it's solid. Maybe the part of me thinks it's a New Year's Day special, part of me thinks it's a Dalek story and wants it to be better. But then again, I've seen Chris Chibnall try to make amazing Dalek stories and chuck all the ideas under the sun at the screen in a short runtime, and it not really be that satisfying and having a great feeling of untapped potential. So therefore I'm glad that he just went simple idea, and overall it came across decently well. Now, most people were talking about the Next Time trailer rather than the episode itself, and that might seem like a rather bizarre thing to do, but that's because the Sea Devils are coming back. Now, I was a bit confused where it said coming soon a Legend. I thought, that's a bit of a shit episode title, Legend. I thought that's a bit rubbish, but then it was the Legend of the Cedar Zuck. Oh my god! Because the thing is, people have been wanting the Sea Devils to return for flipping ages. For like every single year, people have been like, Sea Devils, Sea Devils, Sea Devils. There's not been a single fan who hasn't created their own storyline of how the Sea Devils would return. People have created animations, audio adventures, or just ideas in their head like I have, of what I do to have the Sea Devils reintroduced in a modern context. Everyone has done that. I remember, I think Batman March did a pretty good animation with it, the Sea Devils, I think Television as well. But yeah, everyone's done stuff with the Sea Devils because everyone wants them to return, because they're such an iconic villain. We're the most iconic Classic Who villains, and we're the only iconic Classic Who villains who haven't appeared, and they look cool, they've got a really cool voice, and the Sea Devils is a decent John Pertwee story, a little overrated, but it's still great. And honestly, that Sea Devils soundtrack is honestly probably one of the best soundtracks of the 70s. I really hope that Sega Nakanoda does his own spin on the Sea Devil theme, incorporating some of the stuff from the 70s soundtrack, because that's great music. But yeah, the Sea Devils are coming back in a story about Chinese pirates. Really interesting, actually. Chris Chibnall is always great at telling a story on a time period that I'm not all that familiar with, and I have no idea about Chinese pirates or any of that, so I'm really interested in this story. And also the Sea Devils, well, they look great and don't look great at the same time. They look great in the sense that they are a very faithful adaptation of the Sea Devils. They are very faithful to what they looked like in the 70s, unlike the Silurians when they came back in the Matt Smith era that look completely different. These are very faithful. They almost look identical in terms of the mask to what they look like in the 70s, which on one hand is great, but also it does look like a mask. It doesn't look real, and even though the animatronics work, it looks pretty good, the mask looks like a mask. It doesn't look real. But then again, it never looked real in the 70s, and to be honest, even though it looks a bit silly, I'm glad they went for the faithful adaptation. In terms of a faithful adaptation of the Sea Devils, this is probably the best you could do. So yeah, I can't really believe that they finally brought back the Sea Devils, because the idea of the Sea Devils returning had been rumbling on for so long, they almost felt like it was just something that would never happen, to be quite honest with you. I never thought they'd bring back the Sea Devils, but they actually are, and that's weird, isn't it? It feels quite weird that they're actually coming back. But yeah, Sea Devils are coming back in Easter, I believe. That gives you something to look forward to for the Easter special. My one concern is that Chinese pirate Sea Devils is quite a lot, and is that enough for a 60-minute story? You know, can that be fitted into the runtime? Will it feel rushed like Revolution? I'm a bit worried on that front, but then again, I'm very excited. So thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, drop a sub, and hit that notification bell to stay notified for all my latest videos. What did you think of Eve of the Daleks? Do you agree with me? Do you not? What do you think about my thoughts? Do you feel perhaps a little bit mixed like myself? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you think, drop your thoughts in the comment section below. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. But yes, thank you guys for watching. I hope you all had a good New Year's, and I hope you have all a great 2022. Thank you guys for watching, and of course, a goodbye.